Hi, my name's Andrew Francis, and we're going to continue on with our series on Isaiah the prophet. Today we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 23. This is a fitting conclusion to Isaiah's series of judgments on the nations. The series began with the judgment of Babylon, a great city at the eastern edge of the world, and concludes with Tyre, another great city at the western edge of the known world. You might also note that the description used of Tyre echoes those used in Revelation chapter 18 verses 11 to 24 describing Babylon. This would suggest that Tyre, like Babylon previously, are being used in a way that is representative more than literal. Babylon's greatness lay in her achievements, her culture, her accomplishments and sophistications. Tyre's greatness lay in her wealth and maritime accomplishments. Between these two nations, representing east and west of the known world, Isaiah is summing up the world of the time. John Oswalt writes, Isaiah's response was, "Do not trust the nations of the world. They are not preeminent. They do not hold your destiny in their hands. They, like you, are under the judgment of God, your God." Further to this, Oswalt believes that in various ways Isaiah is letting Judah know that the glory of the nations, the scheming of the nations, the wisdom of the nations, the vision of Judah, and finally the wealth of the nations are all as nothing before God, which is why he's asking, would you put your trust in these nations? And so Isaiah 23 verses 1 to 7 we read this. The oracle concerning Tyre. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is laid waste, without house or harbour. From the land of Cyprus it is revealed to them. Be still, O inhabitants of the coast. The merchants of Sidon who cross the sea have filled you, and on many waters your revenue was the grain of Shihor. The harvest of the Nile, you are the merchant of the nations. Be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea has spoken, the stronghold of the sea, saying, I have neither laboured nor given birth, I have neither reared young men nor brought up young women. When the report comes to Egypt, they will be in anguish over the report about Tyre. Cross over to Tarshish, wail, O inhabitants of the coast. Is this your exultant city, whose origin is from days of old, whose feet carried her to settle far away? Isaiah talks of the ships of Tarshish, which is more likely a type of ship rather than an attempt to tell us where the ship came from. They were large trading ships returning home after selling all their wares, only to discover when they arrive in Cyprus that the port that they are returning to is no longer there. Their city has been destroyed and they have no home to return to. Sidon, representing Phoenicia, just as Jerusalem represented Judah or Samaria, Israel, is a nation for which Tyre was a port city. Through the Tyrian traders, Tyre has become a commercial hub of the region, trading grain from Egypt as mentioned, and many other places, making money on what it brought and sold. Tyre was in many ways a broker between nations, making money with the wealth and goods of others. As Oswald states, she has become so much involved in trade that she has become the trade. Whilst in verse 4 my translation doesn't directly reference Yam, the Canaanite god of the sea, instead simply speaking of the stronghold of the sea, this would actually make much more sense of the original text, in which it seems Sidon is lamenting that she has trusted Yam and now she is bereft of her children. All her hard work has left her with nothing. It seems as if Yam has never really shared Sidon's concern and is excusing any responsibility that Sidon felt he should have had. Verse 5 simply highlights that the implications for Egypt will be deeply felt. Egypt throughout her history relied on the Phoenicians for trade and for its own survival. Now one of its major sources of income has been removed. Not only will Egypt feel its loss, but the destruction of Tyre will be reported throughout the Mediterranean, even to Tarshish, the place the prophet Jonah was heading in his attempt to run from God's word to go to Nineveh. Tyre had been such a vibrant, successful and well-recognised city, similar to modern Singapore, that its fall would send shockwaves through the world of the time. And so we continue reading in verses 8 to 14. Who has purposed this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honoured of the earth? The Lord of hosts has purposed it, to defile the pompous pride of all glory, to dishonour all the honoured of the earth. Cross over your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no restraint any more. He has stretched out his hand over the sea. He has shaken the kingdoms. The Lord has given command concerning Canaan to destroy its strongholds. And he has said, you will no more exult, O oppressed virgin daughter of Sidon. Arise, cross over to Cyprus. Even there you'll have no rest. Behold the land of the Chaldeans. This is the people that was not. Assyria destined it for wild beasts. They erected their siege towers. They stripped her palaces bare. They made her a ruin. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is laid waste. Isaiah now makes it very clear that the fall of Tyre is not simply an accident in history or the work of human beings. It is God himself who has purposed this and brought it about. In bringing about the destruction of Tyre, God is yet again showing the foolishness of human pride. And it's not that God doesn't like seeing people do well and experiencing success. Rather, when people attribute their success to themselves and their own efforts, God will not hesitate to humble them. As James chapter 4 verse 6 declares, God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. Verse 10 onwards represents some difficulties in interpretation. It might mean that some of the settlements that are established by Tyre are now free from her rule. It might mean that Isaiah is inviting them to come and plunder their mother. Nonetheless, again, it is clear that God is the one giving the commands and bringing about the destruction of seemingly invincible strongholds. Just as Babylon had also fallen, so too will Tyre and Sargon attack the city in 710 BC, with Sennacherib overthrowing the city in 689 BC. It's of interest to be aware that Tyre came under attack 5 times between Isaiah's time to 332 BC. Because of the way the city was structured, only Alexander's attack was completely successful. The main city was located on the shore, with the citadel being located on one of 2 islands just offshore. If the main city was breached, the residents simply escaped to the citadel. Alexander, after breaching the main city, used its rubble to build a causeway over the water to the citadel, enabling his siege engines access to the citadel. He was able to then breach the citadel. He was so upset at the effort that was required that he is reported to have crucified 2,000 Tyrians and sold 30,000 into slavery. This gives some indication as to why Tyre was considered invincible in the ancient world. In our present day or age, it would be like witnessing the collapse of the United States of America or even China. Both are world powers with large military capabilities. And whilst the USA does seem to be losing some of her power, nonetheless, most of us would be surprised if either country were destroyed in our lifetime. And yet, if we take Isaiah seriously, the destiny of both these nations, like any nation on earth, remains in the hands of God. In verses 15 to 18 we read, In that day Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the prostitute. Take a harp, go about the city, O forgotten prostitute. Make sweet melody, sing many songs that you may be remembered. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return to her wages and will prostitute herself with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. Her merchandise and her wages will be holy to the Lord. It will not be stored or hoarded, but her merchandise will supply abundant food and fine clothing for those who dwell before the Lord. This last section is quite interesting, or dare I say a little bit shocking, if we take it literally. Firstly, we notice that just like Judah, Tyre will be captive for 70 years. It is quite possible that 70 years is a reference to the completeness of time rather than a literal reference to the length of time. In the Bible, 7 seems to be the number of completion or perfection, and we see Jeremiah referring to 70 years in Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 10, and Daniel referring to 70 weeks of years in Daniel chapter 9 verse 24. It might therefore be simply saying that Tyre's resurrection is in God's hands, though the reference to the days of one king does seem a little bit strange. Isaiah then describes Tyre's restoration in terms of the song of a prostitute. This seems to allude to Tyre's past as a broker and merchant, a people used by others for their own purposes, but making money in the process. She's grown old and has been forgotten, but now through her singing and her music, she will again be remembered. Again, Tyre will become a hub of commerce and trade, and again she'll be used by the nations for their own purposes. But interestingly, this time her wealth will be used to provide food, clothing and resources for God's people. God will take Tyre and her prostitution and redeem it for himself. This reminds me of a couple of things. One is a young lady that we worked with who had been a prostitute, and she wholeheartedly came to Jesus. She decided to use her money that she'd saved from her work to help my son with his impending wedding as a way of blessing one of God's people. Or later again we read in Isaiah chapter 60 verse 5, Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. Another prophecy concerning God's people. In recent days, I've been sent so many videos and articles about the coronavirus vaccine, the resultant government mandates in countries like my own and elsewhere, and many things pointing to conspiracies behind the scenes, along with some even suggesting that we are moving to a Holocaust situation similar to what happened in Nazi Germany, with unvaccinated people being treated in similar fashion to the Jews. Now, whether such things are true or false is really beyond my expertise, but what I find disturbing in much of what I'm sent is a complete lack of emphasis on the call to trust God and his purpose in the midst of all that is going on. Years ago, many were predicting the collapse of the world as we know it because of what was referred to as the Y2K bug. It was expected when we got to the year 2000, computers would stop working properly and many computer-based systems would shut down, leaving economies in disarray, banking systems unable to work, power grids disabled, etc., etc. There were even many books written by Christians and available in Christian bookshops warning us of what was to come. So many people swallowed such words and sought to prepare themselves or waited in fear and trepidation for the disaster that was going to take place. The year 2000 ticked over. Nothing significant happened, including, and most of us don't even think or remember that time. Now, in hindsight, we can see that lots of people, including people who are God's people and people who believe that they were prophets, got it wrong. I can't pretend that such things will never happen or that there aren't dark forces at work in our world. But if we do not hold on to the sort of worldview that Isaiah and the Bible itself is presenting us, then fear will dominate our thinking. Isaiah doesn't prophesy difficult days in order to make God's people fearful. Rather, he is letting them know that all things that happen are in his hands. He is at work behind the scenes, that is, God is at work behind the scenes, directing the events of history till a final consummation in which those of us who believe will enjoy eternity with him in perfect peace. Here's what Jesus says in John's Gospel, John chapter 16, verse 33. I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. God bless.